Well, welcome everybody. I know we've got a few more that are going to trickle in here shortly, but I want to make sure we give Colonel Vigouria a full amount of time because he's got some really cool stuff to share with you. So just as a quick introduction, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Vigouria. He is the safety guy here for USAFA. He's a 2001 grad. We were actually roommates back in the day. We graduated from 19 together. And then after a short FAPE tour, he was off flying MC-130s in the SOCOM world. And that's where he stayed for most of his career until he made it back here. We all come back to the academy eventually at some point in our careers. So I know he's gonna introduce himself a little bit more. But the only thing I wanna add is if you have questions, which I know you will, and I hope you do, go ahead and record them in the chat bar. And if it's a quick one, I'll respond to it. And otherwise, I'll let Colonel Vigouria get to it at the end of his lesson. All right. And so without any further ado, Joe, it's all turned over to you.
Hey, Ryan, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity here to speak to your class. It's really an honor to get to do this. I'm coming to you guys this morning from my secret underground lair, also known as the Vigouria basement storage room turned into Dad's office. So I wish I was there in person for you. I think our discussion could be better. But like Ryan said, don't lose the opportunity to put some questions in there. I do have the chat bar up over on the side here on my other screen. And I may answer your questions during the presentation, or I might just hold them till the end because I will have time at the end to discuss. So to get things started today, I'm going to share my screen, include sound, yep. And we'll start with this clip.
I was 20 years old, a young Marine, and I was assigned to the United States Embassy in Tehran, Iran. I had never heard of that country. I hear thousands of people coming down to the embassy. And they started climbing over the gates.
For 2 weeks, I had to sleep with my hands in plastic handcuffs.
And I was scared to death.
The administration is now emphasizing diplomacy as the way to get the Americans released.
Iran must be the only country in the world with a television program on how to tackle American commandos in the street.
There was growing desperation.
I was very determined to get the hostages released.
We were getting ready to run for re-election.
Isn't it about time that this country decides we're going to be respected?
You can't look weak here.
The mission was very plain and simple. Bring home 52 American hostages.
The Delta Force group had been created in 1975.
Only certain people get picked to fly with the special ops.
He said, "I'll see you when I see you." I knew that he was going to Iran.
We would fly into a remote desert location.
Intel said, the road you're landing by is never traveled. All of a sudden, there's this light. I turn around, coming towards us is a bus.
There
was never a full-up dress rehearsal.
All of a sudden, I see this rolling fog bank.
Our flight instruments were starting to fail. It was pretty disturbing.
My friend said, "Turn on your TV. Something has happened."
The whole nature of the rescue involved risk.
I never saw the president so shocked and stunned.
Carter said, if we are successful, it will be your achievement. If we are not successful, it will be my defeat.
Okay, that's a trailer from a documentary movie. It's really very exciting. It's called Desert One. It's out there on different medias. You can pull it up online and rent it and watch it. So I encourage that. But that's what we're going to be talking about today, Operation Eagle Claw. And as Ryan said, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Joe Vigouria. Today, here's what we're going to be discussing. We're going to go through a little bit of the background of Operation Eagle Claw, some of the planning that was involved in it. Execution of what happened, the disaster that happened at the landing site Desert One. We'll go through some of the lessons we learned, and then at the end of today's presentation, I'll answer your class question of, is there an American way of war? Like I said, during the presentation, feel free to post your questions in the chat. I'll try to get to them. If not, at the end, we'll have time. We'll cover the questions. Okay, so a little bit about your guest presenter today. I'm Joe Vigoria. As Ryan alluded to, yeah, I started out, I graduated in 2001, fired up. As you can see down there in the bottom right, that picture, that is not a picture of, yeah, this is not a picture of Lieutenant Colonel Mena's son and my son. These are ourselves when we were about, well, this is probably 20 years ago that the picture is taken. After graduation, I went on to pilot training. I flew the T-37. After that, I was a first assignment instructor pilot. And then after that, I got to go into Special Operations Command and fly the MC-130H, which is the other aircraft that you see up at the top and bottom there. And I spent most of my career flying that airplane. In the middle, that's one of my favorite crews that I got to fly with, May 2011. And the third guy from the left there, that steely-eyed killer, is a younger version of myself. So, all right. Before we get started today in the lesson itself, I'm going to introduce you to the 5 soft truths. Like many of the guidelines and the rules that we have that we've come to know as truths, their history is all written in blood. Today we're going to focus on the truth number 4, and that's that competent special operations forces can't be created after emergencies occur. All right, so let me give you some background of what was going on in our world and in our country at this time. In the 1970s, in the late 1970s especially, we'd come off of the Vietnam War. The American people were disenfranchised with the U.S. military. The military itself was kind of tired of special operations or the attention it had gotten. And our Air Force Special Operations were beginning to be diverted to other areas. The people were assigned to different assignments, going into different training command and other assignments. The money was diverted to other priorities. They were tasked to other organizations. And USAFA training, what did exist, had been completely compartmentalized within each service. 1976, President Jimmy Carter comes into office. That's him with his vice president, Mondale. And during this time, President Carter was friends with this guy, with the Shah of Iran. He was their leader. He was their monarch, if you will, of Iran. And he was a friend of the U.S. He'd been a friend of many U.S. presidents. And the history of the Shah of Iran goes back into another lesson in itself and how he came to power. But just suffice to say, he was friends of the U.S. and we liked him being in power there. However, the Iranian people didn't like him. They had lost, a lot of people had lost trust in him, and there was a lot of talk about how he had mistreated the Iranian people. Well, at some point during Carter's administration, the Shah of Iran got sick with cancer, and he had actually come to the U.S. for treatment, and the U.S. allowed that for him to come over and to be treated. Meanwhile, a revolution was happening in Iran, and this guy came along. Ayatollah Khomeini. He was who they claimed as their Islamic leader, and this revolution that was happening in Iran brought him to power, and he sort of became the de facto leader, especially after the Shah came over to the U.S. It led to a tremendous amount of political tension, obviously, as you can imagine, between the Iran and U.S. And eventually that government was essentially overthrown in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. He was the de facto leader, and he was leading this revolution where their chant was "Death to America." The U.S. felt the tension. They knew there was danger, so the U.S. Evacuated. They did a non-combatant evacuation, and they pulled about, I think it was 4,000 U.S. civilians that were in Iran for one reason or another. They pulled them out of the country and brought them back to the States. But they'd left the U.S. Embassy workers in Tehran in the U.S. Embassy. Well, on about, actually it was on 4 November 1979, it was about 3,000 Iranian students. And you know there's going to be trouble if you work in the embassy and a crowd of people come towards you chanting, carrying, pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini. But they stormed the U.S. Embassy. They overran the embassy. They climbed the gates. They went in. They overtook everybody. The Marine and the guards were told to hold their fire, to just end this peacefully. And ultimately, they were all taken hostage. In all told, they took 66 hostages. However, about, actually 14 of them were released shortly after, but 52 of them remain held in the U.S. Embassy. Obviously, the desire to bring the hostages back was real and intense here in the United States. It was big news. And President Carter believed in diplomacy and stuck with his plan for diplomacy. But unfortunately, Ayatollah Khomeini, he would have none of it. He wasn't going to release these hostages until the Shah was returned back to Iran. Carter didn't want to return the Shah, obviously, because everyone knew that would be the death of the Shah. That was he would come back in order to be killed and as part of this revolution. Eventually, the President Carter finally sort of gave in, and a military plan to rescue the hostages was put in place. Okay, so the plan put in place for the rescue hostages was a top secret military mission. It had been in the works for a while, in the background, ever since shortly after the hostages were rescued. And their mission was simple: to rescue the hostages and bring them home. Now, I'm going to build this slide a little bit. I don't want you guys to think that this is an MSS lesson. It's not meant to be. But I do want to point out how the chain of command worked for this operation and how it's some of the flaws that came up in it. For example, the beginning of the plans for this, it was known as Rice Bowl. It was really the Joint Staff, because if you look at this chain of command, you can see it starts with the National Command Authority, and then it goes right, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, down to a task force commander. And so in that planning, in the Chief of Staff cell, there was a J3 cell that started the plan for this. They picked their task force commander, Major General Vought from the U.S. Army, and then the ground force commander and fixed wing and the helos as well. And we'll talk about those momentarily. But I want you guys to know that inside that chain of command there, underneath the task force, there was 3 separate columns there: the Air Force forces, Army forces, and Navy forces. And none of those 3 should intersect with each other at any point. It was separate chains of command. And if you'd notice, like down in the Air Force forces, you have CCT, which really works very closely with our, like our Army forces and our Navy. And you look over in the Navy forces, and there's airborne assets, the helos in there, that fell under there, but they didn't work with the Air Force side. They were all stovepiped, and they're each their own compartmentalized planning cells there. You guys remember from your reading for this assignment, you've heard several of these names, but that's on the very far left. That's Major General Vought, the task force commander. Next to him is the infamous character Colonel Charlie Beckwith, who was the founder of Delta Force. That he started that team. They officially became a team in 1975. It was a top secret mission team with the mission was for stuff like hostage rescue. And then also on the right there, that's Air Force Colonel Kyle, who was the air mission commander. Both Colonel Beckwith, Colonel Kyle were longtime special operations veterans, highly decorated with experience, most recently in the Vietnam War. So the planning for this mission was often very compartmentalized, but it included a lot of moving parts, as we'll see. So some of the considerations that this planning cell had to consider from the very beginning. They knew the mission was going to involve Delta Force. Okay, I skipped ahead. Okay, they knew the mission was going to involve Delta Force accomplishing the hostage rescue. That was their mission. However, getting them to the target in Tehran, it drove a lot of other planning questions and considerations. Here's a few of them, right? First one was the ground force. How many of them did you need to accomplish the mission? And Colonel Beckwith knew exactly how many he needed. They had gone through several rehearsals, and he knew how many of these men were the minimum number he was going to take in to accomplish the mission. So then the question came up: how do you transport these Delta Force Special Operation Forces? Well, they knew it was going to be, how are they going to get them? And they knew it was going to be challenging, and there was going to be long range, so they were going to rely on fixed wing. And the fixed wing support for special operations was, and still is for a large part, the MC-130. That's the combat Talon, the MC-130E you see there. But the sheer distance involved in getting these people into Tehran and Iran had to involve the fixed wing. The other planning considerations, well, they knew that they couldn't just bring that fixed wing plane right in Tehran, so there was going to be a helicopter assault force, a helicopter movement to get them in there. So they started planning out which helicopters they could use, and in sort of a fault in their planning, they determined they wanted to kind of everybody to have a little piece of the action, so they used some Navy helicopters. And then they decided on the Navy RH-53 that you see here because it was able to fold its blades back, and they were able to stick it under the deck in the USS Nimitz so that it wouldn't raise any suspicion as to why these different helicopters are being flown off of a carrier out in the ocean off Iran. There's more to follow later on this whole sheer distance to get in there and why we had to use fixed wing. Another thing in the planning consideration was how many of these helicopters we would need. And I told you that Colonel Beckwith knew exactly how many ground assaulters he needed. So then that drove a minimum number of 6 helicopters to accomplish the mission, the hit, if you will, the hostage rescue in Tehran. 6 helicopters required. So they ultimately added 2 more on there just so they had some spares. So then it came up the question, who's going to fly the helicopters? You know, the Navy pilots that actually flew these helicopters weren't the best at flying low-level navigation over desert for long distances. So they ended up getting a group of Marine pilots for the most part to operate these helicopters. There would also be a need for some supporting fires to the ground force while they were on this mission in Tehran. So that's where the AC-130 came in. They were also planned into this operation. And then there was also a bunch of other questions about how they were going to go about refueling those helicopters. Okay, so this is, I apologize, it's not the best quality of rendition here, but it shows an important point in history here. That's actually a Air Force helicopter. I believe that's the HH-3 being refueled from an HC-130, which had it was the same refueling setup on the MC-130, where the C-130 would fly along and refuel these helicopters as we had proven many times in Vietnam, most notably in the Son Tay prison raid, that it could be accomplished. But remember, they wanted everybody to have a piece of the action, so they opted not to use the Air Force helicopters for this, which the Navy helicopters they chose weren't capable of aerial refueling. So that forced a ground fuel option. Now, forcing a ground fuel option drove a couple other decision points. How were they going to get the fuel on the ground for these helicopters to get it? And so there was a ton of innovation that happened in testing. As you can see in that bottom right picture, that's very recently some MC-130s dropping heavy equipment out over the ocean. Those are actually big boats they're dropping, but they tested dropping fuel bladders using that same technique, where they put a bunch of fuel bladders in the back of the C-130, drove out, and they tested airdropping them. And by the time they figured out how far apart they could drop them where they didn't hit the ground and collapse and explode, they determined it was going to be too spread out. It wasn't going to be feasible. So that drove a ground fuel option. They had to, the planners, through all this trial and error, they determined they had to land these C-130s on the ground, set up some sort of fueling operation, and bring the helos into them to gas on the ground. That took a little more innovation. They determined, some aspiring young troops determined that they could take this Vietnam era big fuel bladder that was actually used at these forward operating bases, and they would put them at these helicopter bases and just fill them up with gas, and the helicopters could gas off of them. Well, they determined they could stick one of those in the back of a C-130 and then use the C-130's fuel system to pressurize them, and from there be a mobile gas tank for the helicopter. Okay, so here's the plan they finally came up with. The planners decided upon, and follow along because it's a little bit complex to say the least. On night one of this operation, the USS Nimitz would start by doing a deception operation along with the USS Coral Sea in order to deceive the Iranian trawlers that were out there off the coast into thinking they were doing something else, so then that the helos could depart from the USS Nimitz. And again, 8 of the RH-53 Deltas took off from the Nimitz. We're going to take off from the Nimitz up towards this landing site in the middle of Iran. 3 MC-130Es, carrying the ground assault force and a Ranger blocking team, we're going to take off from the island of Masira off the coast of Oman, along with 3 EC-130Es, which don't get too wrapped up around in what type of C-130 it is. The point of that plane was to carry fuel. They were the ones with the big fuel bladders inside of them. They also departed for Masira Island for the LZ, known as Desert 1. Now, side note here, the landing zone was named Desert 1 because there was also a Desert 2. This is all night 1 plan, but the Desert 2 we'll talk a little bit more about later. Anyway, the MC-130s and the EC-130s were to depart Masira, fly across Iran into this landing site, Desert 1, then transload the crews, offload fuel and the Ranger. And then later, those EC-130s and MC-130s were going to come back, and they were going to transit the crews over to Wadi Qina, Egypt, for a night 2 portion of the operation. The helos were going to depart Desert 1 on night 1 and drop off the Delta Force near Tehran. They were going to sit in their hide site, the Delta Force assaulters, as well as helicopters. They were going to go up in the mountains and basically hunker down through the day in a hide site and wait for night 2. The Delta Force was going to rendezvous with an agent in country and move to a warehouse and prepare for night 2 of the assault. Okay, night 2, Delta Force was going to move from the hide site to the embassy, and they were going to capture the hostages. No small feat in itself. The Delta Force was going to then move the hostages to a soccer stadium after they blew a hole through the back wall of the embassy and moved through there and into a soccer stadium next door. The helos would leave their hide sites out, and they were going to come in and land on this soccer stadium, all under the closeful watch and cover of an AC-130 orbiting overhead. The MC-130s, the crews that had been on night 1 that had transited over to Wadi Qina, were going to infiltrate some Army Rangers at Mansouriya Airport. This was just outside of Tehran, and it was a really good airport, and this is the one they called Desert 2, codenamed Desert 2. The Rangers were going to seize and hold the airport. The AC-130s were going to fly cover overhead. And then the helos with the Delta Force and all the hostages were going to move from the soccer stadium to Desert 2. Then at Desert 2, some C-141s that were also in Egypt, down at Wadi Qina, were going to fly into Desert 2, load up all the crews, the hostages, and everybody that was there, all the Americans, onto the airplane and depart. The helos, before they departed, were going to be left there and destroyed in place. As you guys can tell, that's an extremely complex plan with a lot of moving parts. How it all would have worked, we don't know. We'll never know. The mission didn't make it past night 1. Okay, so what happened on night 1 of the operation? Yeah. Okay, on 24th of April, 1980, that was night 1. 8 helicopters, as planned, departed the USS Nimitz. The EC and MC-130s departed Masira Island with the Delta Force and the Ranger security or road blocking team. However, as they were transiting, before they were too far even off of the Nimitz, one of the helicopters experienced a mechanical issue. It landed right there in the desert of Iran and troubleshot the issue, and fortunately for them, one of the wingmen was able to see them and landed with them. They determined right away that there was a crack in one of the spars, one of the blades on the helicopter, and it was unflyable. So they left it there. The crew that was on that one loaded onto the other helicopter, and they proceeded on towards Desert 1. Now down to 7 helicopters. This is a picture of what's known as a haboob in Iran. It's a large dust storm. It's tremendous, where just large amounts of dust get suspended midair for sometimes thousands of feet high. And unfortunately, it wasn't forecast, but there were two of these this night, 24 April 1980, in Iran. The MC-130 and EC-130 crews experienced it on the way in, but in the fixed wing, it wasn't as big of a deal. However, one of the prerequisites and direction they had during this whole mission was calm out, no communications. They weren't allowed to talk on the radios, on open radios, so they couldn't converse with the other aircraft, the helicopters. So when the helicopters hit it, it was a lot bigger of a deal for them. They flew into it. It was very challenging for them to fly through, and they continued to press. However, during the haboob, in one of the haboobs, one of the helicopters, it started experiencing some major electrical issues. They lost all their navigation for a while, and so they unilaterally decided they couldn't press on. So they climbed, they turned, and they went back to the USS Nimitz and landed. The whole thing, again, it was calm out with no radio calls. So unknown to everybody on the whole force, that left 6 helos. They were down to the min force. Nonetheless, the EC-130s and the MC-130s, they arrived at Desert 1, but it wasn't without incident. As you saw in that trailer, as soon as the first airplane landed and taxied into its position to set up, they saw headlights coming down a road. Now picture this area in the middle of Iran was a giant dry lake bed with hard packed sand, and right down the middle of the lake bed was the hardest packed sand, and that's where they assessed they could land a C-130. Well, for the same reason, in this big open area in the desert with hard packed sand, there was also a road that had kind of been created through there where the vehicles would travel. Again, Intel had said nobody ever traveled the road, hardly ever, so it wasn't going to be a threat. But after that first one landed, and they started to offload the first Ranger team there, they saw headlights, and so the Ranger blocking team and the road security team went out there and did what they're supposed to do, and they stopped what it was a bus. And we learned later that it was a bus that a man had. Every year he would charter this bus, put his entire family on it, all of his, all the aunts, uncles, cousins, everybody, and they would go visit this other family in another part of the country. Well, that was them, and they just happened to be traveling through the night, and they happened to be taking this road. And they were very surprised when a group of U.S. Army Rangers stopped their bus and basically held them hostage at that time. The people, the assaulters and the people on the ground said, hey, that's not that big of a deal. We'll just hold these people. We'll basically keep a hold for about 24 hours. Once this operation's over, we'll just let them go again. And that seemed to be not a big deal. But then you can see on the left there's a truck. And that was the next problem. From the other direction, here comes another set of headlights. And this time the Ranger road security teams tried to stop the vehicle, and it wouldn't stop. They warned him, they shined lights, they did everything they could, and then they began to fire rounds into the truck, but it kept coming. It wasn't stopping. So one of the Rangers decided that it needed to be stopped, so they fired a rocket. And when the rocket hit the truck, that's when they discovered it was a fuel tanker, a truck carrying fuel. It was stolen. The Iranian, some bandits had stolen it because the driver bailed out of the truck and jumped in a pickup that was behind it. But that left this giant burning fuel truck right there next to the landing zone, which caused some problems for the other C-130s coming in. Eventually, everybody got in, but NVGs were in their infancy at this time, and so the next pilots coming in to land, the NVGs weren't good because there's this big fire burning right at the edge of the landing zone. But they couldn't really land without the NVGs because it was too dark beyond the fire. So they had some challenges, had to go around a few times, but they figured it out and they landed it. They landed all the planes there. So they had all the planes on the ground, 6 planes, and then eventually the 6 helos showed up at Desert 1. And there's some imagery there of what it looked like with the airplanes and the helicopters scattered around, with the bus at one end of the operation and a burning fuel truck at the other end. However, there was a problem. Once they got the 6 helos on the ground, they discovered a problem. And that was, as they were doing their checks, one of the helicopter pilots had reported some issues with his hydraulic system, his primary hydraulic system. And when they looked at it, It had failed. Catastrophic failure of the hydraulic system. They knew they couldn't fly the helicopter anymore, so they reported back up to the powers that be on the ground there that they only had 5 helicopters. A lot of discussion ensued, as you can imagine, but the ground force commander there, Colonel Beckwith, stuck with his guns. He said, I need this many assaulters, which needs 6 helicopters. We can't do it. So at that point, they decided to abort the mission. Now, when they aborted the mission, they kind of thought, we're going to stop. Okay, we don't have it. Let's get everybody. Let's wrap everybody up, and let's go home. Let's go home. We'll come back and do this tomorrow night. But if you can imagine here, you're looking at this image you see on your screen now. It's all in the middle of this salt flat, this dust. Imagine if you ever been in and around a C-130 or a helicopter when it's sitting there with its rotor spinning or the prop spinning. You know it's loud. It's loud. It's full of debris. There's dust being kicked up. Imagine now, if you will, 6 C-130s and 6 helicopters there in the silty dust of this dry lake bed, running engine. There was a lot of dust. There was a lot of debris flying around. And after the call was made then to abort the mission, everybody on the ground were true professionals and agreed and said, okay, let's do it. They began the task of trying to round everybody up. They had to fuel the helos, and then they to get out of there. And this is where catastrophe struck. Disaster struck. One of the helos, and it's up there at the top of the screen by the number 5, one of the helos, when it was trying to taxi. Now imagine, picture if you will, the helos, in order, they were too heavy once they were fueled up to be able to pick up an air taxi appropriately. So they had to only lift their front wheel and kind of taxi this way. Well, there was a person in front of them trying to guide them, but there was so much dust coming at him that he kind of was backing up. And in doing so, the helicopter ran into the C-130. It impacted the C-130, and both of the helicopter and the C-130 started on fire. There were a lot of people on the C-130 already, and they began to evacuate off of there. And as they were getting off the plane and they were trying to figure out what was going on in the confusion, even rounds, the Delta Force had left. They had a bunch of ammunition, if you can imagine, and a lot of it they left on the plane had started to cook off. So there are rounds firing off into the night as well, creating even more danger. There's another scene, an artist's rendition of what it looked like, and Colonel Kyle, he wrote a book about this later called The Guts to Try, and he described this as the accident as a calamity heaped in despair. And he said it was devastating, devastating to everybody involved, not just because of the accident itself, but because they lost 8 lives in this accident. They lost 2 aircraft. And the 8 people that couldn't get, the crew members that couldn't get off of the helicopter or the airplane at the time. And there was so much devastation because in this mad confusion and everything, and there was so much fire going on, it was so hot they couldn't do anything about it, that they had to leave. And they had to just leave the Americans in the helicopter and the airplane that were there. Here's another picture. This shows the aftermath of the mishap. On the left, you can see the helicopter, and on the right, you can actually see parts of the helicopter in front of the C-130 there, where it had taxied into it and started the fire, and everything just burned straight to the ground there. These are the images of the 8 lives that were lost at Desert One on the morning of April 25th, 1980. And then it wasn't until sometime later, through some more devastating actions with the Iranians there, that the remains were repatriated, brought back to the U.S. and they're memorialized there, at least in this one spot in Arlington Cemetery. After the mission, the crews, they finally did get out of there, and they went back to Masura Island, the C-130 crews. After the mission, there was a bit of a show of national solidarity with our friends, the Brits, there at Masura. One of the pilots, I enjoyed this, one of the pilots that was on this mission was later an instructor in the MC-130 community, so I had lots of opportunity to hear his stories and talk about this, but he described how there were some British contractors working in the control tower there at Masura. And the night before, they had seen 6 C-130s depart right before dusk. 12 hours later, 5 returned. Shortly after, it came on the news there on BBC stations that President Carter was announcing that, describing the tragedy and the failed attempt. So these Brits drove over to where the Americans were, and as Russ Tharp tells the story, he sees a Land Rover pull up. These guys hop out, drop some boxes on the ground, and take off. And when he walked over there was 3 cases of beer there on the ground, and this was scrawled with a marker there on the top in one of the cases. From you all, from us all, for having the guts to try. And that's kind of become the motto of the squadrons that was doing the operation, as well as the MC-130 community as a whole, the guts to try. Okay, so immediately after the failure there at Desert 1, there was follow-on planning that occurred for another top secret mission. They codenamed this Operation Honey Badger, and if spoiler alert, it never happened, and thankfully it didn't, because if it would have, the military leaders at the time described it as that would have been World War III. This was going to be a major operation with a lot of firepower, and would have caused tremendous issues. So Operation Honey Badger, one of the results of this planning was this C-130 that they had codenamed the Credible Sport program, and that's what you can see this image here, the rockets firing on this C-130. They specially outfitted a C-130 with these rockets, both forward firing for it to take off in a short distance, and rear firing once it was about to touch down to stop it in a short distance, presumably to operate in and out of a soccer stadium. This unfortunately ended in disaster as well. As if you go YouTube Credible Sport sometime, you can find that this one, during the testing, the forward firing rockets fired early once on landing, and it dropped hard from a ways up, and a wing broke off. It was pretty disastrous. So ultimately, what ended up happening in Iran was the Shah of Iran, who was in the U.S. at the time, he died from his medical issues in the U.S. and then a war actually broke out in Iran. It was the Iran-Iraq war, and so there was a lot happening in Iran that they realized they needed to let these hostages go. And so thankfully, diplomacy did win, and it was an hour after President Reagan took the oath of inauguration that Ayatollah Khomeini announced that he was going to release the 52 hostages, and they were released. So then that begs the question for us: was this mission a success or a failure? Ultimately, the hostages were released. January 1981. 440 days they spent in captivity. After this operation of Operation Eagle Claw, they appointed a group of people. They call it the Holloway Commission. It reviewed the entire operation and made a bunch of recommendations. One of them was they recommended more jointness amongst the forces, and then they put some laws in place that kept services from diverting the funding they had for special operations forces that it had to be designed just for special operations forces. I probably don't recognize these two fellas, but it's okay. You'll learn about them in a future lesson. You have Senator Goldwater on the left, and on the right, Representative Nichols. And those two later on, this was later in a few years after Operation Eagle Claw, they co-authored the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which it led to the establishment of U.S. Special Operations Command, or SOCOM, as we call it. They recognized it as a functional combatant command with service-like responsibilities to man, train, and equip special operations forces from each of the services. And you can see here that's Special Operations Command as it stands today, with our Army, SOF, our NAV Spec Warfare, Naval Special Operations Warfare, Air Force Special Operations Command. The new one to the group, Marine Special Operations Command. It took them a while, but they are now MARSOC. They have been for a few years. And then the one you read about in all the books, Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC. Let's look at a couple operations here to answer that question about whether this was a success or a failure. I want to look at two different kind of operations told through the story of these two images you see on your screen now. One was the before Desert One, the Sante raid in Vietnam, and then one that happened in November 1970. And then the other one on the right represents the Osama bin Laden raid. in May of 2011. So in Sante, when they went in to rescue these more prisoners of war that were being held in Vietnam, it's an amazing special operations aviation story. I encourage you guys to read the books on that. It's really awesome. The beginnings of Air Force Special Operations Command, where they did refuel helicopters in flight. But it was a very compartmentalized mission, again, and it was ultimately a failure because sort of, again, the left hand wasn't talking to the right, and these other government agencies knew a lot that was going on that the military at the time didn't know about. And so that it ultimately, by the time they got there were no prisoners there. Compare that again with 2011, the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden. It was an incredibly coordinated operation. The planning across SOCOM was amazing, and with the other government agencies. Nobody was hurt. No U.S. forces were hurt in this operation. And then the target, again, Geronimo, occurred successfully. Osama bin Laden was KIA on that one. And then ironically, I like this image because both images represent how we crash landed a helicopter in a compound and then blew it up on site and left it there. Very interesting. Okay. I now have to answer the question, is there an American way of war? So I'll answer through some pictures here. Let me jam through these. Let me bring up some history from Desert One in answering this. NVGs, okay? Now we take it for granted. Everybody flies on NVGs, or a lot of people do. The first NVG landing in a fixed-wing aircraft happened 23 days after those hostages were taken in Tehran. Okay, something they learned to do. They said, we're going to have to do NVGs were just something Jeep drivers used at the time. But they figured out how to fly with them in a fixed wing and land the plane. They've improved over the years, but they still have their limitations. This is what they coined, the term they coined for the fueling helicopters was called FARP, F-A-R-P, FARP, Forward Area Refueling Point. And this is images of my airplane, and we're refueling some MH-60s out in the desert of Nevada. But you can kind of get a feel for how much dust there is kicked up. It's practiced regularly now. Okay, so this came from that operation. They were innovative. They practice it all the time. The equipment's improved. The tactics have improved. We've lowered the risk of doing this operation through extensive training. In fact, in recent years, we started a thing where we started to FARP fighter jets as well. But it's the same. No, it's the same tactic that was developed 40 years ago. Okay, and we're still practicing it today. Finally, this the third one I'll highlight in this when we think about an American way of war was this idea of blacked out refueling. That's a KC-10 that they're refueling off of here in a C-130. But notice the lights are on. Okay, when they did this operation, they needed to be able to do this in the dark without comm, without communication, and they developed that tactic and they did it. These guys developed the capability, and it's been refined over the years. However, the need to refuel airplanes and helicopters still serves as a major limitation in how we fight our wars. Okay, so on to our next thing, and this is kind of how I'll wrap up our lesson for today. Is there an American way of war? Well, I believe there is, and I believe it's marked by these three attributes or abilities, if you will. The first one is to innovate, okay? If you look at Desert One and you look at all of our operations, we come up with new ways of doing things, right? And that's our challenge out there, is to come up with a new way of doing things, always keep ahead of the enemy. The next one is to adapt. Look around and see how the fight needs to be fought, not how you want it to be fought. And finally, overcome. It's some tenacity involved. Win. And when it doesn't look good, do it anyway. All right? That's our American way of war. And I leave that today as your challenge for you, because if there is an American way of war, it's constantly being redefined. And how that's defined in the future, it's up to you guys. Okay, with that, thanks. I'm going to try to figure out how to turn off my screen sharing and open for questions. Okay, first question from Ethan. Why would a mission plan for FARP over AAR? Good question. It depends on if the biggest limfac on that is if the aircraft is capable of air-to-air refueling. Okay, that makes sense. not all of them are equipped with probes, right? So not all of them can take gas. The CB-22, the MB-22 can. Some of the 53s out there can, and 60s can, but a lot of them can't. And a lot of our Army that we're moving around or doing an op won't have probes on their helos, so they have to ground refuel. Another reason we practice FARP a lot, and this one's very cool that I did all the time in my C-130, we can fit, you guys know what little birds are? You heard of little birds, the AH-6 or MH-6? Black Hawk Down. You ever watch Black Hawk Down? It's the little helicopter, the bubble looking on the front, and they come up and they have miniguns and all kinds of wild stuff on it. Those don't refuel in the air, right? So in our mission that I would do, we would fit one or some other classified number of them on a C-130, fly into some zone like this Desert One kind of thing, or near the site, and they would roll these things off of the helicopter, off of the airplane, swing the blades out, start it up, and go. And while they were going, we would then kick out the FARP kits and our hoses, and those guys would go over and they would support an op, and then they would just bounce back and forth and hit us, get gas, go back, and so forth. So that's one reason why something like that would be planned. I can tell you today, if we were to do Operation Eagle Claw today, it would probably be CB-22s and they would AAR. That was a good question. What other questions do we have? Okay. Sir, you mentioned one of the soft truths is you can't develop soft forces after an emergency. How do you prepare and train for emergencies that you don't know exist? Oh man, good question. Great question. Who asked that? Colton? Hey, that's cool. Hey, and you guys can feel free. I think we have a couple minutes. You guys, if you want to ask a question, jump on, turn your screen on, raise your hand, whatever you want. You don't have to type it in there. That's a wonderful question because we can't. Okay, we don't know what the future brings. So that's why you have to have this mindset of being innovative and ready to apply in lots of different situations. We don't know, we can guess, but that goes back to that truth, or one of the things I left you with is you have to adapt. You have to fight how it needs to be fought, not how you want it to be fought. And I can tell you, after several years of flying and working at Special Operations Command, we train very hard to a mission set, and we're ready to do it. And so we try to plug and play that mission set into different scenarios, and it doesn't always work because we're wanting to fight how we're trying to fight how we want to fight, not how it needs to be fought. So you're right, you can't always plan. You train for everything you can. Some missions like hostage rescue, pretty straightforward in the overall mission set, and they just finalize it down to different things. Like you can take that, a SEAL Team 6, which is very good at what they do, and you can drop them in the middle of Abbottabad, I think that's where it was, in Pakistan, and they can take that mission set to Osama bin Laden, right? If it's there, if it's somewhere in Yemen, wherever it might be, they're going to accomplish the same mission. But you're right, you have to be flexible. That was a good question. Who else has a question for us? Go ahead.
Yes, sir. I want to talk about those takeoffs you were talking about with the MC-130s with almost like the rockets on the side of the plane, and that would allow for a shorter runway. Was that actually executed in the hostage crisis, or because it never really got that far, it had to be postponed till later?
Right. So that plane, they outfitted. That was the Credible Sport you're asking about. They outfitted that plane and they tested it several times. It proved its operational capability, but they never used that in that situation. That Operation Honey Badger never happened, so they never had to go land it in a soccer stadium. But you can see the idea of JATO existed, jet assisted takeoff, where they put the jets on the back of a C-130 so it launches, it can take off real short. But the idea of the forward firing rockets, or the rear firing, I guess, to stop it in a short distance, hasn't been operationally proven that I know of, or that we know of.
Okay, so it's never been used. It's just trained, but never been used.
It doesn't exist anymore, Haley. I'll tell you that. That plane that they had that outfitted and tested upon crashed and broke apart in some of the testing. So as far as I know, they never outfitted any more like that. It just there was others. That's where the MC-130H came from, and different capabilities and more. That's MC-130 history. But that airplane, the Credible Sport, ended right there.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sir,
good question.
I believe the Blue Angels, the Navy's F-18 demo team, they have a C-130 with the rocket boosters still on it. I think that's one of the only ones that.
Yeah, that's right. Fat Albert is what they call it, and up until recently, they were still demoing those at like air shows and whatnot, the JATO takeoffs. And those still exist. And if you look at C-130s, a lot of them still have the mounts for jet-assisted takeoff on them in case we ever needed that. But the idea of the other, firing the other direction to stop it abruptly, that didn't expand beyond the Credible Sport program. Yeah.
Got about a minute and a half left if there's anybody who has a real quick question.
Sir, did you ever read McRaven's book, Admiral McRaven's book?
Are you talking to me or Colonel Vigria?
Colonel Vigria.
I believe I have. What's the title of it?
It's just Spec Ops. It's a series of case studies.
I've read portions of it for different things, but I've never sat down and read it cover to cover.
I was just saying, I've been required to read it for a class. I was curious if you had a take on his 6 principles of special operations.
Short answer is no.
Fair enough. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, short answer is no. I don't have a take on those, but I can tell he's an incredible leader. I've had the opportunity to work with him, and specifically in some high-profile special operations we've done in Afghanistan, and yeah, incredible. I'd follow the guy anywhere because he's a good leader, has a good plan.
Well, thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Good question, Ethan. Ryan, I think that just about sums up our time, so I'm going to hand it back to you, but I appreciate the opportunity to do this for your class.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you. Your expertise is much needed, so we really appreciate it. And it's an interesting story, and for everybody else, thanks for tuning in. If you have more questions for Colonel Vigria, feel free to either email me or email him directly. And we can keep this conversation going because there's a lot of cool stuff here, and there's a lot of cool things that SOCOM does or that SOF does that I don't have experience with. So we can continue to bring bring Colonel Vigria back into the discussion as long as he's willing to do that.
Anytime. I love talking about this stuff.
Cool. Well, thanks again. I appreciate it. And for everybody else, I will see you all on Monday. It's supposed to be virtual, I think, unless you hear from me otherwise. So that's all I got for you. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
ZoomieLink is the hub for connecting you to the larger Air Force Academy graduate community. See how your fellow graduates are already gathering online to discuss, advise, and serve. Connect with graduates at all stages of life and start a conversation about careers, transition tips, and preparing for your future. And with ZoomieLink now open to all current Academy cadets, the time for connecting to the graduate community is more important than ever. Sign up at ZoomieLink.org and start connecting today. Brought to you by the Association of Graduates and the Air Force Academy Foundation.